Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Chris Erickson. I'm a professor in the management school and the director of the International Institute. It's my honor to welcome you all to this happy occasion to celebrate one of the titans of political science and Middle East studies here at UCLA. The International Institute has 26 research centers, and 2 of them are co-sponsoring today's event along with the Political Science Department. One of our most venerable centers is the von Grunebaum Center for Near Eastern Studies. This is a center that encourages, coordinates, and integrates instruction and research in the humanities, social sciences, business, law, medicine, and the media, and in all languages essential to an understanding of the Near East. It's an intellectual home from scholars from various academic institutions in California, for independent scholars who contribute to the regular program of colloquia, workshops, lectures, conferences, and a variety of outreach activities sponsored year-round. I especially wanted to describe this center today because Professor Binder, as director of the center, was central in building it into one of the very best in the nation and the world. And of course, in the process, demonstrated to us all that he's a true institution builder in addition to a distinguished scholar and teacher. We also have a second center that's co-sponsoring today from the Institute, and that also focuses on the region, the Center for Middle East Development. Through conferences, task forces, publications, and other programming, this center explores key subjects for the region, including the Arab-Israeli issues, Gulf security, regional business and economics, technological cooperation, regional strategic cooperation, and democratic culture and media. Its annual conference in Doha on enriching the Middle East economic future has become legendary for bringing together prominent experts to consider realistic and constructive paths forward in the region. So once again, I'd like to thank both of these centers for co-sponsoring, as well as the Political Science Department. Now I'm going to introduce someone I think probably does not require an introduction for most, or maybe even all of us, to introduce today's program. The person responsible for the Center for Middle East Development, Steve Spiegel. Steve's a professor of political science at UCLA, where he studies American foreign policy in the Middle East. Through the innovative and informal negotiation techniques he's developed, Steve's helped to produce cutting-edge ideas for promoting Middle East regional security and cooperation. Among the many accolades for his work, I should tell you, he received the Karpf Peace Prize in 1995, which is awarded to the UCLA professor considered to have done the most of any faculty member for the cause of world peace in the previous 2 years. Again, welcome, everybody, and I give you Steve Spiegel.
Thank you very much, Chris Erickson. It's my task to provide the opening announcements and getting this program going. Before we get to the matters at hand, I'm also burdened by having to make several announcements. Let me say, first of all, that we have this quite intriguing table at the front, which some of you may have seen, thanks to Salome Ohajer, who's standing right here, who more than anyone else is responsible for getting everything together the way it is so perfectly. And there are 2 main and particularly important items on that table now that you're all in here. And that is, first of all, this kind of sign the great book opportunity, where you can write a message to Leonard Binder, which he will receive at the end of the afternoon. There are also all of his books that he wrote. We have up there in case anyone wants to do a little extra reading this afternoon or take a peek. So I do want to announce those. I'll be reminding you about the sign-up book all afternoon. I also want to thank, as Chris has mentioned, the other centers that were involved in the sponsorship. The International Institute, which Chris directs, the Center for Near East Studies, the Political Science Department, which was the home department of Leonard Binder, and to some extent still is in emeritus status, and our Center for Middle East Development, of course. And let me make one quick announcement about a future program tomorrow morning at 10:30. We have Adam Garfinkel, the editor of the American which is edited out of Washington, D.C. We'll be talking about current American foreign policy in the Middle East. That'll be in 10383 Bunch Hall, and we invite all of you to attend. And we don't believe it'll be as hard to get in as this afternoon. I want to note 4 students who are here, current students of Leonard Binder, as he continues to guide students on their way towards PhDs. And we didn't burden them with having to speak this afternoon because they're busy on their dissertations. I would ask them to stand as I call their names. First, Eric Bordenkirscher, who expects to complete his dissertation within the next few days. I'd like to think hours. And it's on the complexities of Lebanon and its impact on the region internationally. Quite a fascinating dissertation. Ben Rodpavar. Ben is working on so-called Iranian constitutionalism. It's quite a fascinating study, which he hopes to complete by the end of the calendar year. Kristen Kao, who is working on, there's Kristen, who's working on coalitions and complexities in Jordan, and Joy Farmer. Joy, there she is in back, and Joy is working on the provision of public high schools in Lebanon to explore why politicians in an ethnically divided country sometimes choose to allocate public services disproportionately to their own ethnic groups and sometimes don't. Quite an intriguing topic, which she hopes to complete before long. So let's get an applause for all 4 of these current students of Leonard Binder. Our honoree this afternoon was born in Boston in 1927. And I must say, as someone who is very humble, it was very difficult to find some of this information out, more than you would expect. He received both his BA in 1952 and his PhD in 1956 from Harvard University, studying as well at Princeton and Oxford. And in 1956, at the age of 29, arrived at UCLA as an instructor, and was here until 1961 when he went to the University of Chicago. We didn't have the University of Chicago insignia, didn't care that much, but so that's not listed on the program. But of course, Professor Binder was at Chicago from 1961 to 1985, when, to the astonishment of many people around the country, he returned to UCLA, where he still is, of course, and he retired in 2012. That's, if you don't count emeritus, that's a 56-year career, quite, and at the top of the field through all of that time. It's quite an amazing accomplishment. Not only a distinguished professor of political science at UCLA, but he served as a founding member and as president of the Middle East Studies Association, as we've been saying, chair of the political science department at both the University of Chicago and UCLA. And under his chairmanship at UCLA, the department was reached the rating of 9th in the country in political science, which I believe is the highest ranking it's had before or since. He was also director of the UCLA Center for Near East Studies, as Chris mentioned, again, leading that center to one of its greatest series of moments. I won't get into his books, which are up front, or to his many honors. We'll be talking about those later. But let me say one thing. When we designed this afternoon, what we wanted to do was not what Jeff Lewis, the chairman of the political science department, who you'll see later, calls a living memorial. We'll do a little of that at the end. But what we wanted to do is really represent and honor Professor Binder's career. And what we meant by that was to have his students do most of the speaking. And I think it's really an honor to Leonard Binder that the 5 students who will be coming forward in a minute or two flew here at their own expense from around the country, and we'll be introducing them. They're all students of Leonard Binder, and they're going to speak about their current work, and we're going to have a discussion among them. They don't necessarily know each other. Some of them were at UCLA or Chicago together. I don't know how many retired faculty could marshal that kind of attendance. But the point is, we wanted a different kind of program, not just a sort of wine and cheese greeting, isn't the emeritus great? But we wanted to focus on his achievements and how better to do it for any faculty member anywhere than to highlight his students. And that'll be true in both parts of our program, the second part, which is about Leonard Binder, and the first about what Leonard Binder hath wrought. So let me ask the panel to come forward, and we will begin the first part of this afternoon's program. Panel? So we're going to begin in the following manner. I will introduce each and give each of 3-4 minutes, 5 minutes at the most, to introduce their topic. And then we're going to have a general discussion between the six of us, and then we will open it up to you for questions. We start with Lisa Blaydes, who's far to my immediate right, your left. She is an associate professor of political science at Stanford University, the author of Elections and Distributive Politics in Mubarak's Egypt, Cambridge University Press. She received the 2009 Gabriel Almond Award for Best Dissertation in the field of comparative politics from the American Political Science Association. I could go on and on about her articles, as is the case with every one of these individuals, but if I did so, you would be hearing me and not them, and I'm not going to do that. Lisa Blaydes' topic is the determinants of authoritarian rule. Lisa?
Thank you so much, Steve. I'm truly honored to be here and have the opportunity to honor Lenny and his legacy through the work of his many, many students. As Steve mentioned, I'm a 2008 PhD. The dissertation that Professor Binder was my dissertation chair for won the main Comparative Politics Award from the American Political Science Association, and I owe a great deal to his amazing advising for that project. So I'll be telling you a little bit about that project and also how it fits into my broader research agenda. So my research is motivated primarily by trying to understand a puzzle, which is about the persistence of authoritarianism in the Middle East, particularly the Arab world. We know that a critical mass of democracies exist in almost every world region, but the Arab states are almost uniquely undemocratic, and this provides a really important question or motivating puzzle for me. So we know authoritarianism tends to co-vary with economic underdevelopment, and this also tends to be associated with other types of outcomes like extremism and patriarchal societal practices. But what are the practices that actually sustain authoritarian rule in Middle Eastern countries? And this is sort of a puzzle I try to tackle in two ways. The first is by looking at the internal dynamics, political dynamics of contemporary authoritarian regimes. And here I have two projects to tell you a little bit about. The first is based on my book manuscript, which focused on Egypt. And this is really kind of the story of the soft authoritarianism of Hosni Mubarak, in the sense that political elites and populations were mobilized through electoral processes in that context. And this represents a very different model than the second, which is the subject of the book I'm currently writing, which is Iraq under Saddam Hussein. So in the Egyptian context, the main argument that I try to put forward is that competitive parliamentary elections in Egypt served as an effective mechanism for distribution of rents to key populations, and that this had really important implications for stopping the elite from splitting. Now, of course, we did see an elite split that emerged in Egypt in 2011, but that was actually a split within the ruling elite, right? So the split between the military and the actual office of the presidency. The book that I'm writing about Saddam Hussein now is based on 10 million documents that the U.S. government found in the basement of the Ba'ath Party headquarters upon the U.S. arrival in 2003. So these documents represent really the internal story of how repression took place within that context. And this is a project I've been working on for a couple of years now, and it's really a fascinating set of documents, and I encourage those of you who are able to access the materials, the Arabic materials, to come and visit the collection. What I find is that, Iraqis were engaged in a variety of different types of political behaviors, even under the most repressive of circumstances. So you would think that there wouldn't be any kind of a anti-Saddam movement going on in Iraq during the repressive periods, but in fact, people were engaged in many small acts of noncompliance, and the Ba'ath Party did a very careful job of documenting those. So for example, there are collections of political rumors that circulated in Iraq at that time, and many of them are really fascinating. There are stories about basically the way different types of people were punished for the transgressions they engaged in. And there's a narrative about informing and what it meant to live in a totalitarian style state for the breakdown of societal trust between individuals. So it's a very interesting narrative. I'm hoping I'm going to have a chance to share that with you through my work as it comes forward. The other part of my research agenda really tries to understand why it is the Middle East ended up in this kind of what I'm calling a bad equilibrium or equilibrium trap. So what are the factors that led the Middle East to have these sort of four bad outcomes, which I consider the authoritarianism, the economic underdevelopment, the societal patriarchal practices, and the forms of political extremism. And here I think that the way to do this is really by looking over the very long historical duration. So it's one thing to understand how authoritarianism manifests itself in the Middle East today, but it's another thing to try to explain why it is that we observe these outcomes. And so that agenda takes on more of a historical nature and seeks to try to really identify where in the historical trajectory the Middle East failed to develop the types of institutions that really helped Europe to grow and be democratic. And so that's the key contrasting case that I try to develop in that part of my research agenda. So I wanted to just share a couple thoughts with you about Professor Binder's influence on my work. And I think the first really is in the incredibly disciplined logical thinking that he brings to any task that he seeks to try to answer, any puzzle that is sort of intellectually confronting him. And I think that one of the nice things about being at UCLA is we lived in a department, this was in the 2000s, where game theorists and area studies people could sort of coexist very peacefully and happily. And that's not always the case. So there are many departments where that would create a conflict or tension within the department, but not here. And so I think that it was really important for me to be working with an area studies expert who thought through puzzles in strategic ways and really brought that type of strategic thinking to political actions. I think that the second major form of influence was through Professor Binder's work on subnational variation within Egypt. So he has this wonderful book, the 1978 book, In a Moment of Enthusiasm, where he makes an argument about Egypt's second stratum. And this book was really influential for me as I began to think about writing my own book on Egypt. And who do you really need to please? And who kind of emerges as a relevant power broker in this context? And I think that both with his very innovative, for their time, quantitative analyses and amazing data collection that went into that project, and also this sort of identification of where the key class structures lie and who's really critical in maintaining these regimes, it was really important for me. The third intellectual influence is perhaps a little less direct, but maybe more important, which is, as a graduate student, reading Islamic liberalism. This was among the most challenging tasks that I confronted. This is, of course, Professor Binder's 1988 book. And while I'm sure that much of the nuance of the text has been lost on me because I dare not think that I would understand all that he offers there, the basic message is pretty clear. He wants to try to understand, does there exist the basis for a liberal Islamic tradition? And he argues that there is a basis there. And to me, this speaks to a question of equilibrium selection. So I sort of began the talk by thinking about how the Middle East ended up in this bad equilibrium. I think there's a broader question about opportunities lost and how it was that this more liberal equilibrium didn't emerge as the one that dominated, and to really try to unpack that is a task, I think, for me and for others that goes far beyond thinking about Islam as a religious identification as the key variable, but really thinking that there are many manifestations of this Islamic tradition, and it's a sort of question about how we arrive at a certain set of beliefs and outcomes that dominate that is a big motivating puzzle still. Finally, on a more personal note, I just wanted to express my appreciation for the tremendous support Professor Binder has given me over the years. I had my first child when I was a graduate student. He was my advisor, and a lot of advisors might, not look so kindly upon that kind of a personal choice. But I have to say that I felt as though there was never any kind of a negative updating that took place at all. In fact, I felt very, very supported during my time here. And when my son was born, his name was Jonah. And I think Professor Binder thought I named him after Jonah, since this is the name, the shared name Jonah in English, Yonah in Hebrew, Yunus in Arabic. And so we have the shared bond of having a very close loved one with this same name that has such a strong resonance in all of the major religions. So thank you, Professor. I'm looking forward to today.
Thank you so much, Lisa. To her immediate right, your left, is Larry Rubin, who is an assistant professor in the Samman School of International Affairs at Georgia Tech. And he has published a very interesting book, Islam in the Balance, Ideational Threats in Arab Politics, from Stanford University Press, just this year. And he's a co-editor and contributor to Terrorist Rehabilitation and Counter-Radicalization, New Approaches to Counterterrorism. I want to say that he is also the associate editor of a journal, Terrorism and Political Violence, which is associated with the Center for Middle East Development, so we're really proud of that. So Larry's going to speak on when political ideas threaten states. Quite appropriate for now, Larry.
Well, thank you very much, and it's quite an honor and pleasure to be here. I don't think I would have ever imagined this. I don't know what I would have imagined when I started a PhD student. We won't mention the year, but we were in the same class. But, so I've got very broad research interests, and they deal with both international, you could probably hear from, goes these big topics, international security, to also Middle East politics on the ground, and I really just a lot of times can't make up my mind what I'm more interested in at the time, so that has to do with it, or you can call it intellectual curiosity. But I'm going to speak a little bit more on the Middle Eastern side, in terms of the local politics side, and having to do with ideas. And I didn't really think I would come to focus so much on this. It's not necessarily how I view the region, but more and more as far as, and I'll talk about this later, of how Professor Binder had such an influence on me, more I got into in terms of the field work and how I kept hearing about identity and ideas so much. So the notion is, if you hear from the title, Islam in the Balance, Ideational Threats in Arab Politics, and for an academic crowd, ideational may or may not meet some definition. For most of my other friends, they need a dictionary, and they're pretty smart. But it has to do with this notion, specifically in the title. We know about balance of power, about being military threats in the region. But this really looks at the notion that ideas can be national security threats. And this is precisely what the book argues in this way, and it shows how and why. So in these cases I looked at how the rise of Islamist regimes in Iran and Sudan affected the domestic and foreign policies in Saudi Arabia and Egypt. And what I looked at, and primarily, is how basically how these threats affected it, what the states did, and how the threats that were affected by the Islamist regimes, how did they interpret this, and how did they respond, how did it change their foreign policies. Also, I want to look at the notion of what is this notion about just ideas? How can this possibly, what's the logic behind it? So I looked a little bit into I looked at the mechanisms of how this works, how states might project these ideologies. It's not just that, okay, some state declares themselves to be an Islamic state or in that way, but it's that they have to actually do something, and the population has to also be somewhat receptive to this. So the idea that there has to be a projection in some sort, in some fashion. And so this was basically the foundation partly of my dissertation, and then later the book. And I can't tell you the title of the dissertation because I can't quite remember it, but which is probably a good thing. And it's taken actually what was interesting also in terms of the development of when I was changing it or finishing that process over what was going on in the Arab world, and I was almost kind of waiting it out because it was still unclear whether religion would or wouldn't be more important, and what type of ideology might be. But it did, I think, play to my advantage that the events that happened did do this, and so. Other research I've been involved in, that I've conducted, has a lot to do also with religion and politics and the connections a lot of times to domestic and international politics. And I'm going off a little bit, but how a lot of times states both manipulate and use this to their advantage. So one of the arguments in the book is also how states, instead of using their military balances, how they kind of, as I call it, ideational balancing, is what they do to balance against this. And in terms of the rhetoric, how there are various tactics that they might use in terms of neutralizing a threat, almost in a sense like kind of rolling back or containing certain types of ideational threats. And I've carried this in other work in various aspects of how, looking at various religious state institutions, of how they do this at the domestic level. And an article that I had on Jordan, calling the rise of official Islam, how this is kind of manufactured. And fortunately today, there was a Washington Post Monkey Cage blog that, with my co-author, we put that out today. And it had to do in responding that if you look at how basically some of these states are responding to the Islamic State that rises, and it's not so much about them penetrating the borders. A lot of times it's the ideas that they may be able to use as national security threats within borders of other states. And in a region, as we understand, where we don't really have these powerful projection capabilities in a lot of areas. So these are, just one more step broadly and more related to the influences. Another project that really is interested in ideas, but not so much about these broader connecting the international level, and something I've been very passionate about more recently is my second book project that I'm completing now, is on the Islamic movement in Israel. And having had that exposure in other parts of the Arab world of actually seeing Islamists, they may not like to be called Israeli Islamists or Islamist Israelis, but in many senses the ideology is the same. And to see also their connection to the international sphere and the similarities and differences of some of the rhetoric that they have is quite fascinating. And this looks at much more of a micro level of how I look at mechanisms of mobilization, how they deal with the state, and how they deal with their own internal population. So I want to actually end in the same way that Lisa did, in talking about a couple, two influences, or actually three, and two in terms of my research agenda. One is that, and I've mentioned it before, of how Professor Binder, and I cannot call him Lenny, others might, but it's always going to be Professor Binder to me, encouraged us to really use that soak and poke method of just, it's okay to go to a region, and it's okay to have conversations that may not be related to your topic. It's in fact encouraged, because you learn so much more. You learn not just in terms of that project, but you learn so much more, the breadth of knowledge about the region, about maybe it's your life, it's about research methods, as we always develop these skills of interviewing. I mean, I think they're invaluable. I think they're often played down of how important they are, of how much you learn, how many new ideas come. It's almost this urge or itch when I'm not in the region to go talk to people, and it's really a privilege that we have a profession in this way to do it, that we get to go talk politics to people and get to learn from them. And I think that's what also Professor Binder taught, was that human element. There's also something is seeing people, not just knowing them and getting to know them, but also if you want to take a step back and being that they're a social text, you can understand them in a certain way, in a certain context, and what you can learn from them in their position. And that's quite remarkable. It's something that I encourage my students to do as well. Also, from something more on the academic side, as far as written published work, one of the articles that I had the most influence on me was the Middle East is a subordinate international system, and this article was written in 1958, and I still assign this article. It's not just because every time I read it I pull out something, and it's not just because I tell my students, look what this guy saw in the region, and it's still so relevant today. But it's also the way that there are two things that I try to teach too, and I try to incorporate this in my own research. One is always thinking about the world in a map and the regions in the map. This is one of the things I took about thinking about maps, thinking about then in addition to that, and how these identity characteristics overlap with various things. The other thing I took from it was also how, and how, in a sense, the map is, this is a chessboard of many different layers of games. Now, the whole thing, a lot of the notion had to do was it wasn't just here, this international system, we can talk about systemic level driving politics, there are all these regional games going on, but there are also sometimes games going on at various levels, and within the various games at the regional level, but also within within a higher level. And it's really to think about what I got. I was, maybe I'm completely wrong, and I never asked whether you were a chess player, but I get a sense in that way, but if not, thought about the world in such an incredible strategic manner. And then, actually in looking back, we were looking in the lounge recently, and I said, wow, this is amazing, because this is really, in looking at the arguments, this is what really inspired me when I was a graduate student. And how I wanted to see the world, how I wanted to incorporate basically bridging, which is the primary takeaway, I think, in terms of the impact in the field, bridging the international relations theories with area studies. And one of the things that Professor Binder encouraged me to do is, saying, look, you have to, use your area knowledge and cultural tools to be able to say something also about the international system in this way, if you're going to see yourself in this way. What are you going to do? What's your comparative advantage? In part, it's this knowledge, and how are you going to use it? So lastly, and it's a good thing I talk very fast, lastly, that I'm very deeply appreciative now in my teaching of how, when I was a TA for Professor Binder, how he handled very, very complicated, complex, controversial subjects with students with really care and these are emotional, as we know, doing the Middle East, some of these topics are very emotional. But, it was almost like a dispassionate passion, but yet at the same time there was passion for this intellectualism about the region. And I think you can do both. And I'll say, and it's not even in a sense to brag about me, but the most rewarding comment, and I attribute to the Professor Binder, is students saying, I could tell he was really passionate about the subject, but I was really frustrated that I couldn't tell which side he was on politically. Thank you very much, Professor Binder, for everything, and I look forward to hearing you later.
Abdulkader Sinno is to my immediate right, your left. He is the Associate Professor of Political Science and Middle Eastern Studies at Indiana University in Bloomington, and a 2014 to 15 fellow at the prestigious Woodrow Wilson Center in Washington, D.C., where he's writing a new book on Muslim minority representation in Western democracies. He has his first book is Organizations at War in Afghanistan and Beyond for Cornell University Press. He's also an editor of a volume for Indiana University Press, Muslims in Western Politics. Again, as with everyone else on this panel, I could go on, but let's hear from Abdulkader.
I will start with an anecdote. Sometimes in October or November 2001, when Professor Binder was director of the Islamic Studies Center here, the Van Granbaum, he had a guest at a seminar. And that guest, whom I knew and who knew of my research, took me by surprise at the seminar. And he asked me, he said during his talk, well, Abdulkader, you've been to Afghanistan, right? Now, let's pause here for a second. I was an Arab man in my late 20s at the time, who was in Afghanistan, and to take away the stress of writing a dissertation was taking flying lessons at Santa Monica Airport before 9/11, which I stopped immediately. And I made the decision very quickly, and they said, no, I wasn't there. Later, I had a meeting with Professor Binder and his office, and some of my fondest memories are of spending hours in this office, having conversations with Professor Binder, and just learning from him how he thinks, the strategic thinking that Larry spoke about, which was just illuminating. And then Professor Binder said, well, why did you answer no to that question? And I explained, I was afraid. This was a time of uncertainty. We did not know, I did not know what would happen to people like me. And he looked at me and he said, Abdulkader, flaunt it. That was the best advice anyone has ever given me, academically, professionally, and otherwise, I can think of. And I did flaunt it, and I went about writing my dissertation, which later became my first book, and it was well received. It also benefited from many other, from those conversations in many other ways. The strategic thinking that I do use in my book was inspired in big part by that of Professor Binder. I was always amazed during those meetings. I felt I was talking to a brilliant somebody who could have been, if they went into policy, a Kissinger, in a sense. But he is the academia's Kissinger, somebody who understands what every player thinks. We all took Professor Tom Schwartz's courses on game theory, but Lenny Binder knew how to see the whole balance of preferences and motivations in an interaction. And that was just brilliant. Also, I learned from him to pursue whatever answer you want to pursue without caring what others think. Because it's only when your product is finished, then they can really appreciate its value. And so I went against the grain. I made an argument that was original, an organizational theory argument about who wins in conflicts, in civil wars, when no one really cared about who wins at the time, because we were all concerned about how to bring peace. And now, I later moved on, of course, as we all do as academics. I love to always research new areas. But not only that, I learned from Professor Binder that you should never quite stop learning new methods, new ways of thinking, of doing things. In those conversations, and it's not often that you find somebody at a mature stage of their career learning new methods. And Professor Binder was improving his own understanding of linguistic methods, linguistic analysis, as well as game theory. And I was really surprised by, when I would hear him not only learn those concepts, apply them so brilliantly. And so I found that for me, this is also a wonderful way to proceed. He was, by example, a great influence on me. And so I moved on. I learned how to do surveys, how to do experiments embedded in surveys. And I've been doing surveys and experiments regarding attitudes towards Muslim minorities in the West, including very recently a project to solve a puzzle about why in several European countries the publics believe that immigrants, including Muslim immigrants, abuse welfare benefits when in fact we know from research that they don't. And I find the solution through content analysis of newspapers, articles, as well as surveys and experiments. I also am doing research on Muslim representation, which also measures several techniques, including 220 interviews in 6 countries, as well as surveys and experiments as well, and statistics. Now, the topic I'm going to talk about today is more relevant substantively to more related substantively to Professor Binder's research, especially the book Islamic Liberalism. I spent about 4 months in Tunisia and 2 months in Egypt trying to figure out what factors causes changes in the policy attitudes of Islamist parties. There's large literature out there about the moderation of Islamist parties, but I question the term and I focus on change instead, because moderation is really something that's culturally biased, that's biased based on the standards of the observer or of the writer. And in Tunisia, I was given access to the Al-Nahda party's headquarters for 3.5 days. That was just terrific. Suddenly, I was an anthropologist as well. I was doing using a new sort of research. I was an observant participant, and I was given access to their archives, some of their archives, not all of it, and some of their newsletters, etc. I interviewed about 40 people, and what I found is that, contrary to what much of the literature says, and much of the literature is monocausal, explains change in the attitude of an Islamist party based on one factor, I found that during the different stages of the development of an Islamist party, and probably many other parties, not Islamists as well, at each stage you have different factors that lead to change in their attitudes. In the case of Al-Nahda party, you had the formative period in the 1970s when the leaders were high school and college students. In that period of time, they were influenced mostly by some thinkers, including some philosophers, not just Islamist thinkers, but also by their opponents and their rivals, the socialists. When the socialists made success, they learned they made mistakes, and they figured whether they could adopt that agenda as well or co-opt it, especially supporting labor rights, etc. In the 1980s, the period of repression and imprisonment and exile, well, surprisingly, women played a big role in shaping the whole party, the party's policies, because many of the men were in prison and women took charge of the organization in Tunisia itself. There were those who were exiled, of course. And they became important. They showed what they can do. And so the party became a major proponent of women's rights. In fact, when in Tunisia, after the revolution, the question was raised about whether there should be a quota in the parliament for women. The party that pushed first and foremost for it was the Islamist Al-Nahda party. And the leader of their parliamentary bloc is a woman, Mahrzia Labidi. Also exile mattered, etc., because the exposure to Western thought, as well as having many of the young women in exile become highly educated, many with PhDs from London universities, etc. They influenced the party on those issues. There are several other factors. I'm just limiting myself to two just for illustration purposes. And so while Professor Binder's book on Islamic liberalism is actually more theoretical, more concerned with the text and itself, the way it connects with my work is because the Nahda party, when the party issues a consensus, it becomes enshrined in the writings of the leader of the party, Rashid Al-Ghannouchi, who is a prolific writer, and whose writings are available widely. And this, they become hard to change because there's a commitment issue here, once they're enshrined in text. And he does it when there's after a consensus. It's partly guidance, partly consensus. And you find in the text, and I use Islamic liberalism and some of the ideas there to tease out the theological arguments in the text. And I have found it to be incredibly, incredibly useful still. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Our first three speakers have PhDs in political science from UCLA. We're going to make a bridge with our next two speakers. The first is Heidi Lane, who received her PhD at UCLA, but in Islamic studies, and also is the only person here, I believe, who went to school both at UCLA and the University of Chicago, where she received her BA, but not in the Binder time, as I recall. Heidi Lane is Associate Professor of Strategy and Policy and Director of the Greater Middle East Research Study Group at the U.S. Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island. She is currently completing research on a book manuscript about the effects of counterterrorism programs on state liberalization in the Middle East. She is also co-editor of a manuscript entitled Rule of Law in the Arab World in Transition, to be published this year as well. Her topic is the new counterterrorism. Heidi Lane.
I guess I should use this. Thank you very much. Thank you for including me in this occasion. And especially I'm delighted because there are legions of people who not only couldn't be here, who would have liked to, but would have been great on a panel. And I'll say this a little bit later, but there are people I run into all the time now in outside of academic life who have come across, who have crossed paths with Professor Binder in some way or another, to include senior military leaders of other of Arab nations who suddenly, you find out have passed on a book about Pakistan to their Iranian counterpart or something. So I've had these wonderful anecdotes by being a little bit outside of the academy in recent years. Let me just say a couple things about the work that I'm doing, because it is not exactly traditional academic appointment. I'm an employee of the Department of Defense now, and by the way, all of my comments are my own and do not represent the Department of Defense or the Navy. My students are professionals in their own right. They're not undergraduates. They have 10 to 20 years in the U.S. military as officers. Some of them are colonels, some of them are majors, or they are parts of different agencies like CIA, DIA, Coast Guard, any government agency you can think of, State Department. And, as such, they are pilots and intelligence analysts and budgetary people, and really have a lot to teach me as well, which is something that I learned about being Professor Binder's students as a very valuable attribute once you get to be on the other side of the table, which is that listening and learning from your students is great too. In addition, I have, and they're not all mine, obviously, but among the 600 or so people that come through the U.S. Naval War College every year, there are about 60 international officers from various countries who come through also that join the class. So it's a very nice and rich environment in which they get an MA. The research that I've been doing for the past several years has a lot to do with probably the context that I'm in, which is looking at how the growth, I shouldn't say growth, the explosion of interest in counterterrorism and somehow counterinsurgency, and the huge amount of not only US money but international focus on this has created essentially its own enduring institutions that then, whether we like it or not, in fact have a great impact on the rule of law. Sometimes maybe detrimental, sometimes not. I'm not yet sure I want to make a judgment call on that, but I admit that I went into it thinking this is probably not a good thing when the money that's flowing to support counterterrorism is then also defining in some way the parameters of what those institutions look like. For example, how you train judge advocate general officers, that is, lawyers for the military, on how to handle certain issues within their own context. For a lot of countries, as we know, especially in the Middle East lately, the way they handle it is first and foremost not with an eye towards necessarily you're innocent but until proven guilty. So there's a huge change perhaps that is 14 years in the making that I'm trying to make sense of in my research. The obvious connection with Professor Binder's life work, I think, not the only area, is really through the lens of democratization. And, you know, of course, many of the people in this room have debated that, written about it, and talked about how, when, if democratization, liberalization, reform will reach the countries of the Middle East. This is where I came into it, through radicalization, looking at very radical groups that do a lot of incitement, and now I've sort of moved over to the institutional bureaucratic side of it. The things I'd like to say about Professor Binder, actually, I think I'm going to echo some things that were already said in general. And I'm glad, because I thought maybe I was the only one who felt this way, and now I know that my other counterparts had a similar experience that was, you know, very positive. One thing I'll say is that about the impartial judgment, I don't recall a single instance ever when I felt that the questions I was asking or the route I was taking somehow were being judged in a negative way by my dissertation chair. Now, they may have been somewhat misleading in some cases, and there were times when I walked away from our office hours thinking, I wish that you would, Professor Binder, tell me what to read next, or how to view it, or what literature I'm missing. And I know now in retrospect that that is very limiting to an intellectual, to your maturation as a scholar. You have to traverse that road yourself. And the guidance that you did give was always very helpful, because at the end of the day, it is your job as a scholar to know what interests you and why, and to take a risk and figure out whether that is going to carry you intellectually and sort of mentally to the next place. And also to not be so concerned about whether or not it fits into the right disciplinary approach of the day, the flavor of the day, the methodology of the day. I spent at least 2 years trying to master statistics. Actually, I was in Larry's class. I came out of it a bit bruised, and others didn't, but it was a necessary part of my education. The other thing I would say that I have learned, and I really now hope I embody, is civility in scholarship. Something that often is missing in the field, especially in contentious areas of Middle East politics, where somehow all of a sudden the people who have the very nice positions in different universities forget that they are representing the whole field when they come out and say abusive things about their colleagues, or take a stance that frankly is outside of intellectual objectivity. You know, it's not that you can't have a position or voice it, it's just that, as I learned from being your student, doing that civilly and as a gentleman or gentlewoman is the way to further the discipline. So I very much appreciate that. And I must say, I also would not have survived in the place I am without that, because it is unfathomable to most of the military, at least, that we would be battering each other in journals in open space without having a dialogue. The third thing I learned, and I guess I'm going to continue to learn this, I hope for 50 years, is that scholarship is very cyclical, and the questions we ask are they're not only timeless, but they're essentially kind of finite. And the tools we may use are changing, but the questions get repackaged again and again. And now I think back over the many books that you've written and what I've read, and I realize they could be written about today. And the method or the entry place where you discuss that is different. But the questions, you know, being a University of Chicago grad, Thucydides was our basic meat and potatoes, and fear, honor, and interest, and why states are motivated by that is part of all political development. And it takes a lot, I think, for someone who has written as much as Professor Binder has over so many years to allow the next generation or the generation after that to essentially remake the wheel in their own way and not say, we have seen this already, and yes, there's more to be done, but for goodness sake, didn't you read the last part of this? That takes an awful lot. The last thing I'll say is that one of the things that I learned and proves very true is that Professor Binder said the dissertation is not the beginning of it's not the end of your academic life, but the very beginning. And boy, is that ever true. And not only that, I think also in looking at the number of ways in which you've contributed and really built much of our field in the United States, coming into it and starting over and doing another area, another subject without fear that it doesn't fit with what you've already done is something we can all learn from. So thank you very much, and I'm honored to be here.
Robert Bianchi is our last speaker in this panel before we interact, and he is the only speaker who received his PhD from the University of Chicago. And he's now a lecturer at the University of Chicago Law School. He is writing a book about China's deepening connections with the Islamic world, exploring their role in changing the balance of power in Afro-Asia and beyond. I, again, do not have time to list all of his many books, but I'm going to just list the publishers. World Scientific Publishers, a couple from Oxford University Press, Princeton University Press, and on, et cetera, et cetera. A little different topic, China and the Middle East.
Hi, thanks. I'll try without the mic, and if that doesn't work, I'll use this. No? Go to the mic? Okay. Thank you. Thanks to Steve and Jerry for organizing this. I've been looking forward to this for a long time. There are at least a dozen people standing behind me who are also Chicago graduates and students of Lenny. And when he looks in this direction, he sees me, but he also sees Jerry, and he sees Eric, and he sees Lou, and he sees Ilya, and many, many more that Jerry will refer to later. I knew the other Lenny, who was not quite the same mellow, carefree guy that everybody's describing here. In my day, when people at Chicago asked me what I was studying and I told them, They said, "So does that mean you work with Binder?" And I would say, "Yeah, sometimes." And they would give me this look like, "What kind of masochist are you?" Or, "Where's your coat of armor? I don't see anything on you at the moment." And I always scratched my head at that reaction, thinking it was a little over the top. But, when I went back to Chicago several years later, after Lenny came out here to UCLA, I went to Chicago. I was there for about 6 years in the same department. Damned if the students weren't saying the same thing about me. People would come and say, I would have my students come back and tell my grad students, and they would say, "Jesus, you have a horrible reputation around here. People think, hey, compare you with Binder, for Christ's sake." Oh, it can't be that bad. Anyway, so these days I'm working on China, and China's deepening interaction with the Islamic world. The gist of it is, how is China changing the world, especially the Islamic world and the Middle East, along with the rest? And how is that in turn changing China? So my interests are back in the Middle East where they started, but they've migrated quite a bit. And they've migrated toward the Islamic world as a whole. And they've also migrated to the intersection between the Islamic world and the rest of the Eastern Hemisphere. My thinking about the Middle East, I suppose, is very different in terms of context and perspective from most of the people who labor in this field one country at a time for their entire careers. I have had the luck to jump around and travel around a bit more than usual. And my 3 years in China and 3 years in Singapore have had a very strong influence on my thinking. I see the Middle East as an area that is very much up for grabs in many ways. It's tearing itself apart and putting itself back together again in ways that will be quite unpredictable. And I think that its future lies largely in becoming part of something bigger than what we think of generally as the Middle East. And what that something might be is quite open-ended. It will certainly be something Islamic. It's likely to be something Eurasian. It's likely to be something Afro-Eurasian. And the larger consequences are certainly hemispheric. And this means that talking about the Islamic world and talking about China and their interactions is really talking about the reconfiguration of the Eastern Hemisphere as a whole, the entire old world. So, this is a big chunk to think about. And there are sort of three simple ideas that are helping me move through this. One is the notion of coevolution from biology. The other is the notion of mega-regions from Brodelian studies of mega-regions of the Mediterranean, sort of the transportation of the concept of the Mediterranean to other areas, not as a place, but as a dream or as a process. And the third is the notion of agency, particularly Muslim agency, the idea that the people who are the former habitants of the Silk Road and the current habitants of the Indian Ocean basin are the people in the middle, between the East and the West, in the so-called flyover area, who happen to occupy the territories and the transit routes and the natural resources that everyone else is interested in, but who will pretty much be bit players or marginal actors. And my sense is that this way of looking at the world as the East and the West and then everything in between greatly underestimates the agency, independence of those in the middle who are largely people in Muslim societies, and that they will have a great deal to say about how their lands and resources are developed and whose benefit they serve, and the balance of power between those who think that they are in the driver's seat in terms of building the infrastructure and the new Silk Roads and transit routes that will connect the Atlantic and the Pacific. So that's the gist of what I do. I find that even today, I'm spreading Lenny's Gung Fu in China, even when I least expect it. A couple of months ago in Shanghai, I met a Middle Eastern, a Chinese Middle Eastern specialist who told me he was studying Egypt and the development of Islamic support for democracy in Egypt. And then he said, and I'm particularly interested in a fellow called Mohammed Imara. And then he said, do you have any suggestions for references? And of course I broke out laughing. And I said, are you kidding? I know the guy who wrote the book about all of those books that you're trying to track down. My connections with Lenny are way more than you want to know. I tried for a few minutes to think of some areas where my writing was not influenced by Lenny, and I'm afraid I came up empty. He's on every page of every work, even if it's about China, even if it's about the Hajj, even if it's about international law, global governance, the management of the commons. There is no escaping the guy. What can I tell you? In terms of the intellectual overlap, I would say most of all it's our common fascination with the transnational and the transcendent. The idea of the Middle East as an international system runs through everything I do. You'll remember Lenny's article is entitled "The Middle East is a Subordinate International System." I always thought it should be called an insubordinate international system. That makes more sense to me, and that's sort of how I'm looking at things these days. Certainly, Islam is a universal civilization. And the beauty of being in Chicago when Lenny was there is the depth of the bench in Islamic studies, in history, and in political science, and in social science. It was a constellation I cannot describe to you because you wouldn't believe me. And Jerry's sitting there because he experienced it as well. But Lenny's teaming up with Fazl Rahman was beautiful. And I had the great fortune to be there right at the time when that project was taking off. And when I went back to Chicago, Fazl was still there. He and I taught a seminar on Islam and politics that was open to the entire university. and it was a huge success. We only did it for a couple years because Fazl was weakening at that time. But you know, I thought I would have a little effort to sell him the idea. I said, come on, let's do this thing. It'll be great. We'll get people from every department in every country. And he said, yeah, okay, I'll do it. And then I said, okay, one more thing. He said, what? I said, I'll do the Islam and you do the politics. He thought about that for a minute, but he said, okay, we'll go ahead and we'll do that. Lenny's book on Islamic liberalism came out of that project, and I learned an enormous amount from that experience. Now, you know, on this personal level, that's where Lenny influenced me much more than anything in the intellectual level. He was without peer, there's no question, in his area of interest. And the people around him were a part of a community that is hard to even imagine now in terms of their combination of, what shall we say, self-confidence, and eagerness to share with one another and learn from one another. And the people who really benefited from that were people like Jerry and I and all of the other students who never once heard anybody tell us who not to study with, who never once heard anybody tell us, stay away from that Binder guy. He's full of this and he's full, not enough, doesn't know anything about that. We were the bees that were encouraged to be promiscuous and pick the honey from every flower. And you know, it took me years to figure out that these guys were getting pollinated from us, and that we were teaching them a few things along the way as well. But Lenny's one of the few people who let me in on the secret from the very beginning, because he never hesitated to indicate when he was learning something from me. And that was really quite unusual at Chicago with that group of people at that time. But what probably set Lenny off most of all, in my experience, not just from other people at Chicago, but for other people in academia and I suppose in the world, is that he always encouraged things in me, or that he saw in me, that were different from him, and that didn't always endear me to other people, especially speaking my own mind and going my own way. And this is something that seemed to be second nature to Lenny. It was something that never threatened him. He never misread any of my comments or behavior as disrespect. He always sought to turn my thinking in the most positive and constructive direction, simply insisting on sound thinking and solid evidence. And if I could provide that, and I could live with the heat of other people's reactions, then I was okay with him. That's never changed. And for that and much more, I thank you.
Here comes the panel when we have the time when we have a little discussion. I'm going to ask everyone a question, and I want 1 or 2 words in answer, and then we'll discuss it. What factor is most responsible, in your opinion, for the chaos of the present moment in the Middle East? I'm going to give you a few. You don't have to pick any of these, but here's the kind of thing I'm looking for: Islam, economic underdevelopment, the failed Arab Spring and failed democracy, inherent authoritarianism, the fascination with violence, wrong ideas and ideology, political extremism, poor education, or something of your own. So, in one word or two, tell me what you would say. It can be one of these, it can be something else entirely different. And Robert, I'm going to go back the other way. So, going to give you
Why
the
is
first
the Middle
shot.
East so messed up?
Yeah.
Because we are.
All right. By we, do you mean the Western world, the Asian world, the United States? Who's we?
Yes.
So you think this is a global factor? This is a global factor?
Yeah, but it starts at home.
Okay. Heidi?
Well,
You want to pass and I'll come back to you? Or do you want to tell us?
no, I've got 2 words. It depends.
You must work for the government.
Okay, depends on what?
Well, actually, it's not 2 words. One of the things that
I'll
I
let
think
you
I
finish.
have learned now that I've had the chance to read a little bit outside of the Middle East, which is rare, I think, for everybody, is that this is not a necessarily any worse time than times that have come before. So we'll weather it.
Okay, back to 1 or 2 words. Abdulkader?
First, I was stunned that on your long list there was no U.S. foreign policy, but so I'm going to support. I'm saying that, of course, jokingly. But I
No,
was,
you're not.
I was trying to be polite. So, okay, okay, the colonial experience and recent and not so recent U.S. and British policies in the region really have played a big role. I mean, many of the monarchies we have since. If when you talk, what you mean by messed up is autocracies, well, many of the monarchies were actually established by the British colonial power in the region, especially in the Gulf, and many of them continue to exist. If you talk about violence, as we know, violence does beget violence, and the invasion of Iraq, we really wouldn't have ISIS today if there was no invasion of Iraq in 2003. And I'm not saying those are the only factors. There are many factors, but those certainly do matter.
By the way, I didn't say messed up, I said chaos. Lawrence Rubin?
Well, if I can include, if a preposition doesn't count, because they usually don't, so timing, I have to go with ideas, timing of ideas. Timing and ideas.
And what does that mean?
Timing meaning a lot of these conditions have been there in the past, as we've tried to explain, and I'm not going to try to explain the outbreak of a lot of these things. A lot of the conditions have been there for a long period of time, but it just has to do with the right combination of factors and the right, the way that some certain ideas resonate at various particular at particular times, and that's the way I would see.
Can you give us an example?
Well, I mean, if we look at sometimes all the explanations of when and why did the Arab uprisings or spring or revolution, whatever you want to call it, break out at that period of time, you can point to a whole host of factors that were there for a long period of time, and you might ask, why didn't it happen earlier? Or what is it just to do this combination? But I think rather than, and I think what's interesting in a lot of ways is just there has happened to be just sort of the right moment to grasp for the right ideas. Looking at that period of time, with the ideas in the sense of it may not have been an ideology at the very moment of the uprisings, but it was just the notion that if you're looking to your neighbors and the demonstration effects, and yes, we can challenge these robust security services that have patrolled us and kept us down for so long. This is some of the explanations of how it diffuses. And then when we get into the aftermath, it's how these might mobilize populations and when it comes to electoral processes that have been opened up. And we look to later in terms of how we're looking really, I think, a reemergence of these types of ideas and ideologies in various forms.
Okay, and Lisa, finally?
I'm going to give a couple of ideas sort of strung together along a historical trajectory. Bear with me. If this doesn't make much sense, I can unpack it. The Neolithic Revolution, river valleys, Mamlukism, the capitulations, colonialism, oil, U.S. hegemony.
So the way I read this, 3 out of the 5 really place the blame basically on the United States, and that's the first speaker, the third speaker, and the fifth speaker. And then we have one who believes, maybe I'm not fair, Heidi, that's not necessarily worse. So the presumption of the question is that things are worse, and you're saying it's not necessarily worse? Is that fair to you? Yes.
Yes.
Yes, okay. Let me try to probe a little bit more in Larry's perspective. In terms of timing and ideas, where do these ideas come from? Do they come from the West?
Right.
Do they come from internally? Where is this process emerging?
Well, I think it's tough to trace exactly where each one comes from, but they have to, if they can't be completely foreign in this way. They're obviously, they come from within the societies themselves and may adapt to their circumstances, may borrow from various aspects. We hear how, in and other people's, not just Abdulkader's research of whereas Ghannouchi, being in exile, is hearing and understanding these ideas and implementing them in terms of his own political thought in this way. So it's really tough to say how, or to put a blame or push it in terms of saying it's coming from one spot. And I don't know if it's so much, I also don't view it to kind of challenge or use the word of blame in this way. I mean, if we also, maybe it's just taking a step back of assuming that quiet is the natural, or that we should be expecting peace in every situation. I sort of see it as, okay, we're looking at a question of processes. Maybe it's, in a sense, for those who might say, oh, it's all about American foreign policy, it's taking, it's really an apologetic, saying, oh, if you want to view history this way, that's the case. But I don't see it in that way.
Okay, so then that having been said, given how you interpreted the question, which, by the way, let me repeat the question because it's been lost in this discussion. What factor is most responsible for the chaos of the present moment in the Middle East? But let's move on from there. How would you fix the problem as you see it? What would you do? What would you recommend? If let me play the role of one of Heidi's bosses. One of Heidi's bosses. And if one of Heidi's bosses came to you and said, okay, we're rotten, you say, or it's internal, or it's socially internal, or maybe if you're saying things aren't worse, why are we sending troops, why are we in such trouble, etc. What would you have us do about? Is there anything we can do? If you think it's the United States' fault, then presumably we should do something different. How should we be reacting to the region? Now, this will be the last round before we go to the group. So let's go the opposite direction. And Lisa, let me ask you first. I'm not asking this in pure policy format, but more, should we be studying something different? Should we be recommending some different kind of factors? Should we be looking at different dynamics in the region? What would you do if you could tell the field, the policy community, the intellectual community here, what to do differently, since all of you seem, since at least 1, 3, and 5 seem quite unhappy with the present. How would you answer these questions? And you're not limited to 2 words this time.
So I thought you couldn't pose a question that was harder than the first, yet somehow you managed
Wanna
to
bet?
do that. I guess, my only sort of advice would be to very strongly consider the structural constraints that are associated with the current situation, that many of them have long-term historical bases, and that that probably the best thing the U.S. can do is butt out and, maybe see if that improves the situation somewhat.
Well, we have a conservative speaker who's going to say that tomorrow morning, I think. But I'm sure you have to get back to Palo Alto. But does your work on Saddam Hussein's materials, does that lead you in that direction? Does that teach you anything?
It depends on who you are. So for the Shia, the 2003 invasion was nothing less than an emancipation. And if you read the documentary evidence, this was a tremendously oppressed community. It didn't serve everyone equally well. So perhaps the U.S. should not be in the business of making these choices. But this is something that is not for me to decide. These are policy concerns, and thankfully, most of us are in a different world. We don't have to make these types of recommendations.
Larry, you've written about ideational threats in Arab politics. You talked a little bit about that this afternoon. So how would you answer my question?
Well, I would, and not necessarily, maybe sort of separating from that rather than looking at those sets of policy implications. But to answer the original question, I'd see it as also lowering expectations having to do with U.S. foreign policy in terms of naturally what the United States can and can't do, a reassessment of what was, I think, an over-exaggeration of power in this manner, and also probably agreeing with not just Lisa, but probably others as far as moving back, not towards isolationism, but definitely in terms of limited engagement. And we can talk about the different trends right now. And we understand why the United States is pulled in, and it's pulled into seems to be pulled in everywhere because it is the strongest power in the world, but it can't do what it often does. And then I think in terms of looking at those limiting expectations, there are probably some things the United States can do, and I think it's really being selective of what it can and can't do when it comes to various conflicts of the Middle East, and not necessarily seeing them all as here's this conflagration of the region itself. Regional policy may not be the best way to approach it, but to approach it by almost by different issue areas, but recognizing that they are connected, and maybe that's the best way to look at it in terms of the building blocks of how to bring some type of change, but not necessarily to go forth, and realizing also where you need to pull out and where you can still remain limitedly engaged.
Well, Abdulkader, you since you're very critical, you talk about colonialism, very critical of the United States and its allies. So what would, if somebody, I'm coming to you and saying, okay, how would you do it differently? We listen to you. We accept your argument, let's say. So tell us how to change.
Okay, isolationism has a lot of potential here. And the reason is because that there's groupthink in policy circles. There's a lot of groupthink. Most policymakers do not think about how different actors, first they have issues identifying actors, and how they would react to American actions in the region, including on the individual level among publics. Now, this weakness, analytical weakness, has led to a lot of hubris in American foreign policy, both the previous administration, the Bush one, and the Obama administration. Let's look, for example, at the bombing of ISIS right now in Iraq and Syria. It sounds intuitive. They have killed Americans, even though it was a response to American bombing, but still, it could have been averted. How does that affect not just ISIS as an organization, the target, but other players? First, it has increased the odds of the regime in Syria to survive this conflict, because ISIS was fighting the regime as well as other insurgents. Second, if ISIS survives those attacks, it suddenly has bona fides, credentials, as a truly revolutionary organization which challenged the United States, whom many among the publics of the region resent for many things, for many of those policies. And this would make it more attractive. It's a problem to stop using drones. From our perspective, drones is an economical way to target specific opponents and somewhat surgical and precise. But in the eyes of the publics of Pakistan, Yemen, and African and several countries in Africa, those are inhumane, robotic cold killers, and that often cause civilian death, and without any accountability, and who can never be challenged in a court of law or in any other way. It causes resentment and increases support on the margin of society for those who are so disposed to join organizations that fight the United States. Ultimately, it produces more warriors against the United States than it kills. The short-sightedness in American foreign policy and its inability to deal with the complexity of the region makes me think that it's better to withdraw from the region, or at least not to be heavy-handed in the region.
Heidi, I'm going to skip you for a moment and jump over to Robert because he's a little bit in this camp. So you're going to get the last word on this round. And Robert, can you, do you agree with Abdulkader? Would you answer the question
I
differently?
would say make Heidi Secretary of Defense.
You said make Heidi Secretary of Defense. I'm not sure you'd be pleased from what I've heard today.
I think that the things, the changes that are brewing in global politics are beyond the control of the greatest of the great powers, and that it's basically a bunch of bad news for entrenched interests everywhere, regardless of nationality or ideology. And from the American perspective, maybe the best thing is to prepare for the hard rain by fixing our own roofs and patching up our own windows so that we aren't damaged too much. So I would say looking at our fixing our educational system, our health care system, having a reindustrialization policy, and so on, is much more important than anything we cook up for the benefit of the rest of the world. In terms of foreign policy, in areas where there are potential conflicts coming, I would say get out of the way and let the good times roll. If you can't support a good revolution, then at least don't interfere with it. And I think what will happen and what needs to happen are pretty close, and that is more revolution and deeper revolution. There is a lot that needs destruction.
So you're saying let the good times roll or let the bad times roll?
Take your pick.
Okay. Now, Heidi, you're the minority of one here. Can you explain to us your position as it, presumably, from what I've heard, differs from your other four colleagues? We got to get you that mic.
Can I ask you the question again?
Sure. What do you mean? Oh, you want the question again? Oh, sorry. You expect me to remember?
I'm killing time.
The question was, what do we do in the future, given your presumptions and assumptions? What do we do in the future, whether policy, intellectual concepts, thinking in different strategic terms, or even tactical terms? How would you look towards the future? I presume that you wouldn't just fix American educational policy and let the good times or bad times roll in the Middle East, but maybe I'm wrong. Tell us.
Well, first of all, I would say that, and I usually say this in our classes, it would be nice if for a change we tried as a nation to take ourselves out of the equation, at least to explain it, because not everything that happens begins and ends with the United States foreign policy or otherwise. You know, countries have all sorts of relations that exclude us. That said, maybe invoking the Hippocratic Oath and starting with first, do no harm. And if it is perceived as a country that we have already done some harm, try to do no more harm. But I'm not sure that means not being involved. And even if I think that it means not being involved, I don't think that that's likely. So you have to deal with the cards that you have. And I think the cards that we have are, and this maybe is because I'm looking at this a little more aggressively right now, I think that actually this administration has stepped back a little bit and been less assertive and not even described our current actions, for example, against ISIS. I mean, if you notice, you don't hear the name of the operation being used in public. There is a name now. It's retroactive, but it's not used all the time as a strategic communication. I think that's very deliberate. That said, there's an awful lot of criticism of that approach, not only by the American public, but internationally, because as the good times roll, there's a perceived greater threat. And probably not completely unrealistic at times. So I guess I would say that, at least from my perspective, one of the things that I keep hearing, and I thought of raising this today, is to go back to the classic Charles Tilley's view of state building. His view of state building, if you look at it, sort of take all of the dressing off that I think Americans have put on it, is not one that's very kind and gentle and has to do with democratization. It has to do with securing the state, making the state secure first. And I think that very often American foreign policy, and maybe currently so, even though we don't like to see this, we are being dragged back into a position where we're being told by allies that first we have to have a strong regime again before we can be your partner. So you back off on the liberalization and the democracy talk and let us get our security forces together. And I think that's something to resist, because we would not recommend that for ourselves. We would not recommend martial law first and then maybe down the road something nicer. But, we study the army should be in the barracks as political scientists. Well, the army is out of the barracks, and sometimes they are prime minister and minister of defense at the same time. Sometimes they are, the interlocutors with our government officials, and we should resist this because it's a trend coming back into fashion.
All right, we've got about 8 to 10 minutes, I'm sorry to say, at the most, for questions and answers. I don't know quite how we're going to play this, but I think we have a mic. Am I holding the microphone? Yeah. Is there anyone who has a question for anyone or for the entire group? Yes. So, right back there. Yes. We're going to get you a mic quickly.
Do you mind raising your hand just so I know? Okay.
Yeah. Standing up might not be a bad idea. Go ahead. Okay. Let us know your name and then fire away.
Yes, my name is Lana Khalaf. Okay, I'm not an academic. I don't have a PhD or master, so bear with me in trying to ask this. When you guys are saying, what's the role of the U.S. or let us not interfere, or us, I'm thinking, what is us? That is the problem. In the world in general, in all governments, that there are two separate, there's the obvious people running the show, and then there are the mafias. And I don't mean Italian mafias, just mafias, And so when we're speaking to all this, there are the conscious, the people with conscience, dealing with how to figure out things like you people here, and the people who are mafias, who are greedy and after money and control and power. So in light of these two realities, what is the U.S. When we say let's not interfere, or who we are voting for? Do you get what I'm saying? So if anybody can answer this, it creates a problem, all this, and it's two separate beings in dealing with the state of things.
Okay, thank you. Are there any other questions? We have lots of questions. Well, here, right up here. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm Nayara Tauhidi. And my question is to
Abdulkader.
I heard and appreciated your recommendation to the U.S., but what would you recommend to the Middle Eastern leaders? What to do about the mess or chaos, whatever you want to name it? What is their responsibility?
Okay, we got that. Next we have, right over here, this young woman here. Yes.
Yes, I was fascinated that from a panel of 6 distinguished scholars on the Islamic world, I have yet to hear mentioned the name that may not be spoken, to wit, Israel. And I was curious, there is a robust point of view that holds that if Israel did not exist, the same concatenation of authoritarian role of women, violence, the whole compendium of 6th century behaviors would still exist. So I would be interested to hear any agreement or disagreement with that point of view.
Okay, we're running out of time. I think we've got 2 more questions here.
It's not a question, it's a comment.
We have very little time, please.
I'll be very brief. I don't feel that the United States could become isolationist and neglect its world name and authority. I came to this country for the ideal of the Statue of Liberty and the pursuit of happiness. So United States must be emerged in the world's business. They cannot look elsewhere. They have to be present. Thank you.
Thank you for that brief comment. We'll link it to the first question when we get the answers. We only have time for one more question.
Another country that hasn't mentioned, Iran. Iran is I think it's part of the Middle East. And in my mind, Iran is almost like China. It's not a democracy yet, but it's there is no real tyrant. I mean, Khomeini is not Saddam Hussein, and it's a very well-functioning country. It's almost a Western country. How come Iran is so good and the rest around it is so bad?
Okay, thank you very much. Very good questions. And we're not going to have all 5 answer all 4 questions, but let's take first, what would you say to Middle Eastern leaders? Anybody have anything to say about that? Volunteers here? Okay, thank you very much, Lawrence Rubin. And then Abdulkader. It was asked to, okay. No, you take it, and then how about the 2 of you taking this question?
It's actually,
and then we'll move on.
Very briefly, is that they're not asking for advice. I mean, one of the big issues when we talk about American foreign policy, and I mean, I don't want to push that too far. There are many other factors that do matter as well that are local, but the United States, as a government, does support and help establish and secure several regimes in the Middle East and North Africa for very strategic reasons that may be misguided, in some cases. And those regimes can become very unpopular, as some of them were targeted by the street protests that we call, that toppled some of them, like in Egypt, for example, and in Tunisia. The US backed both of them, as well as other countries. And the way the United States reacted later to several of those revolutions in the Arab world, some of it was commendable, some of it was problematic. If, for example, officially when it comes to Egypt, the official position of the United States was quite good, but now it's causing up to al-Sisi, for example, in spite of the previous earlier pronouncements. In Yemen, okay, I won't go too long. Steve is getting agitated, so I'll pass it.
You turned me gray quickly here.
So I'm going to just, more of a brief comment. One thing I wanted to insert, and maybe it's a bit of a pushback in this way, of one of the problematics, of course, of retreating from the region, and this wouldn't necessarily go to the advice, but it's something to realize, is that also by isolating, it's almost in a sense, by pursuing the strategy of limited or retrenchment in this way is actually, that is a foreign policy in itself. Like, you're making, in the sense that you're making a statement, you're doing something, and the United States will still and has still gets blamed for it. If you look at what's happened with the United States actions and the various actors on the ground in Egypt, being blamed by both sides or multiple sides, if you're going to say you're 3 or 4 by acting or not acting in one's interest, the United States, no matter what it does, it's going to be blamed for acting or not acting in a particular case. You can even see this in the domestic debates in this country. And I think that's inevitable, just having to do with the nature of the United States power. But it's also a question of if you want to say the Middle East leaders here, there are these benefits that the United States provides, whether it's in your country. This is the way it is. You either accept it or don't. And it's also saying to the American public, here, the United States will get blamed. Are we willing to live with it? And we need to move forward.
Heidi?
Just briefly, to the question Dr. Tawhidi asked about Arab leaders, or I guess Middle East leaders, I would say that be mindful that there's an entire generation now of young scholars who were educated in Europe or educated in sometimes the US, who now are going back to the Middle East and getting jobs there, and they're fundamentally changing the norms of those countries. And I think about, anecdotally, the Gulf Research Center meeting, which is a Saudi Arabian-run organization that has an annual meeting in Cambridge. And in some ways, the leadership is old guard. They would like not to have too much shaken up. In the words of Honorable Zayani, the head of the GCC, he said, we don't want revolution, we want evolution. We want it to go slowly. And in one way you can appreciate his perspective, because his country has come a long way since he was a young person. But on the other hand, the people that are the young scholars in that region, not only are they asking really hard questions and doing really new research, they are doing it at a risk to themselves, which is not, I have no risk. I can ask any question I want, and I'm protected. But they are not, and it behooves the old guard to take a look at their young, budding scholarship. And I think that's true in China, too. That narrative will change.
I feel a little guilty. I cut you off on Yemen. Were you going to say that that's another example of the American failure?
Yes.
Thank you. Now, we've kind of dealt with U.S. and Middle East. Let us deal with Israel and Iran. You have two questions that are basically the same question. One is, what about Israel? And the other is, what about Iran? Which don't seem to be covered by the discussion so far. Okay. I'm going to give it to you first.
Okay, can I just say something, like 3 sentences about Yemen, just so people know what I'm getting at? Just as
Please.
another example of how we don't assess, the United States does not assess well unintended consequences, the potential for unintended consequences. They had an alliance with Saleh, the president of Yemen, during which he gave the United States free rein to use drones in Yemen. Created a lot of resentment against the United States and against Saleh. It weakened him ultimately over time, along with other domestic factors. Now that the regime collapsed and you have chaos, and you had the Zaidi minority forces from the north going down, and the state is weak, cannot stand up to them, who becomes the champions of the Sunni, the majority of the Yemenis? And who's fighting them right now? Al-Qaeda in Yemen. Now, is that an unintended consequence that's really not welcome? Well, now you see why we may think that something is in our interest, but it really goes counter to it because we can't really calculate all the possibilities.
Okay, let's conclude with some answers to these important questions on Israel and Iran. Anybody here want to get in? Larry, go ahead.
The question about Israel is and I think,
No, it's not what you asked?
No, it's a question of if Israel didn't exist, would there still be conflict, right?
That's what you asked, right? What? If Israel didn't exist, there would still be conflict. The people think that if Israel didn't exist, there would not be a problem, and you're asking, is that the case? Do I have that?
I never heard anybody say there would not be a problem. I meant that the Islamic states are using Israel as a pretext for not modernizing.
Okay. Larry, can you do that?
Yeah, I don't really have much to say beyond. I think it's a domestic politics issue that waxes and wanes over periods of time, because in certain
domestic politics where
in the various Arab countries, when it does become popular. When it does become popular, it's an issue to use and to mobilize populations. But if the question isn't, I was going to say, I think there would still be conflict whether the Israel issue did or didn't exist, and you can look at that in terms of varying levels of peace between states and how it's changed over time.
Anybody else want to deal? Lisa?
I've spent long enough at UCLA to know to never answer a question about Israel or Iran.
I do it all the time, Lisa. Well, I could answer it, but I did not actually study under Leonard Binder. So therefore, let me just say this. We did have more discussions in mind, but we found it was just too much for an afternoon. We're thinking of having a another mini conference in which we discuss some of these issues. So let me promise you that that we at the center will have a program on Israel. My own personal opinion, I guess as long as I have the floor, not that it matters here today, is that because of the way we structure this, is that without Israel we'd have most of the same problems. Some of them might take a different form, but this region has so many deep problems that you cannot attribute most, if any, to Israel. Let me leave it at that. These speakers do not usually, thinking yes, deal with the Israel subject, and we did have particularly a couple of people who could deal with Iran, but again, when we redid our program, we didn't have them. But does anyone want to address the Iranian issue? Well, if no one's going to address the Iranian issue because we have so little time, I'll do it in 1 or 2 sentences. I think that the question is correct, and that's what's wrong with what 4 of the 5 colleagues argued. I would argue to them because you can't just completely ignore Iran, and we really haven't adequately dealt with. Anyone want to disagree with me?
Well, no. What I was gonna say, one of the pushbacks I didn't get to was that one of the reasons why the isolationism is, we'll say that it's not really that, is the problem is in part because what to do with our, I'll use this, not calling them allies, but strategic partners in the region and how it affects their perceptions of where the United States is heading. And we see this throughout the dialogues that go on with the countries. Of any move that may be toward an agreement with the Iranians scares some of our strategic partners in the region. And it's not so much that strategic partners, it's what they might do on their own to counter the Iranian threat if they feel that they are left oriented.
Well, we could go on, but we have another second half, and we're running, as it is, about 10 or 15 minutes late. And so I'm going to thank very much our 5 panelists for this wonderful discussion.